It was the sound of wind against broken shutters that first caught his ear, not the high whistle it made over the dry hills, but a low creaking like something giving in. Thomas Rourke reined in his horse at the edge of the lane, narrowing his eyes at the small cabin slumped near the creek. It looked deserted at first, the kind of place a man might pass without slowing. But then he saw her. A woman stood hunched near the steps, wrapped in a worn shawl, her shoulders stiff like she was holding herself together by force. Her leg dragged slightly when she turned, not like an old limp that a body grows used to, but a fresh one, the kind that still burned. Thomas didn't call out. He just watched. The woman didn't notice him. She was too focused on the crooked fence that barely held back a goat nibbling at weeds. She moved with a kind of carefulness that stuck in his chest. Every step told a story. Not just pain, but fear. The kind that didn't leave bruises on the outside. The hills around the town of Deadwell, Wyoming, were dry and cracked by late summer. Dust lifted with every gust, sticking to skin, to windows, to memory. Thomas had been riding for 4 hours without saying a word to anyone, which was how he preferred things since May passed. He didn't expect to find much here. Certainly not someone like her. Her name, he learned later, was Cora. Cora Merritt, 27, lived alone, or mostly alone. Some said her husband had died. Others said he'd run off. The truth didn't fit neat into any story. Like most things in this town. For now, she just limped toward the barn, her jaw clenched like she was fighting her own legs. The goat followed. Thomas might have turned and ridden on. He'd done it before. But something about the way she moved, like she didn't want anyone seeing her weakness, made him stay. He didn't like people, but he understood pain. Back in town, folks whisper about Cora. Said she used to be something pretty proud, fast with a joke. Now she barely met a man's eyes. When she came to the store, she paid in coins worn thin. She never asked for help, but the bruises she hid under her shawl had started talking for her. Nobody knew what really happened the day her husband left. Some said he got drunk and hit her bad. Others said she begged him to stay. All anyone could agree on was that Cora hadn't walked the same since, and no one had seen her smile in over a year. Thomas didn't go knocking on her door. He wasn't one to force himself into another person's mess. But he passed her place again the next week, slower this time. Saw her hauling firewood with one hand, the other gripping the wall for balance. Saw her wince. He didn't offer help. Not yet. He just took it all in. There's a kind of silence and hurt folks carry. A quiet that says more than crying ever could. That's what he saw in her. The inside of Cora's cabin was even worse than the outside. She kept it clean, but poor doesn't wipe off easy. One stool, one pan, 2 cups. The mattress sagged. The stove barely lit. She made her own poultices and stitched the hem of her only good dress so many times it looked more patched than cloth. But what stayed with Thomas wasn't the cabin. It was the way she looked at her own hands like they didn't belong to her anymore. Like she'd once known how to use them to build things, stew, quilts, a home, but now they only trembled. Cora didn't ask for pity. She didn't ask for anything. Even when the banker came down the road one morning, papers in hand, eyes hard and smug, Thomas watched from the bluff, unseen. Heard the man say words like debt and foreclosure. Heard her voice crack only once, soft and low. He thought she might fall right there, but she didn't. She just nodded and shut the door behind him. That was the moment something in Thomas shifted. He didn't ride away this time. That night, he left a small sack of flour and half a pound of beans on her porch, wrapped in cloth. He didn't leave a note, didn't knock, but she found it because the next morning when he passed by, she was standing straighter, still limping, but with something different in her eyes. She looked toward the hills, where she must have known he watched, and for a second, just a second, she looked almost like the woman she used to be. Cora didn't have family. Her mother died when she was 16, and the father she used to speak of disappeared one winter and never came back. She married young, too young. Her husband, Frank, was a man with a loud mouth and fast fists. At first, folks thought she was lucky. He had a decent ranch and charm when he wanted it. But charm wears off fast when the door shuts. Nobody came running when they heard her cry. That's the way it was back then. A man's home was his own, no matter what he did in it. She stopped going to socials, stopped singing, just limped through life like she owed someone for breathing. Thomas knew that kind of quiet. He wore it too. His wife, May, had died 5 years ago. Pneumonia that swept in with the snow and never let go. They had no children, no cousins that stuck, just her and him, and now just him. The house he'd built for her still stood back in the canyon, but it was empty. He came into town, sometimes for supplies, but mostly kept to the land and the quiet. But Cora made that quiet feel different. One afternoon, rain came sudden and mean. Not the kind that soaks slow, but hard drops that slap the ground. Thomas saw her trying to cover her woodpile with a tarp too small for the job. He stepped down from his horse, grabbed the other end without a word, and helped her tie it. She looked at him, mouth open like she might say something, but then just nodded once. After that, she left out an extra cup on the porch sometimes. He started dropping off more than flour, beans, matches, and a mended kettle. They didn't talk much. Didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't heavy. But not everyone kept quiet. That banker came again. This time, with a man in boots too clean for the dirt. Thomas saw them go in, saw the way the man looked at her, like he already owned what was left. Later that week, Cora found a dead chicken in her coop. Neck twisted, no tracks, just a message carved in the door. You're next. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just burned the body and sat on the porch all night with her shawl wrapped tight and a knife in her lap. The next morning, Thomas rode down and handed her a shotgun. You know how to use it? She didn't answer, but the way she held it told him yes. Something in her spine had changed. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing. And Thomas, he wasn't just watching. He was staying. The next time Cora saw him, he was fixing the broken wheel on her goat pen like it was his own. She didn't ask. She just stood on the porch, holding her arms tight across her chest, watching the quiet widower who never asked for thanks. He worked with the kind of calm that made her chest ache, a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words got stuck. So she poured him a cup of coffee and left it on the porch step. He took it without looking up, nodded once, then went back to work. That small rhythm between them, quiet, unspoken, became the thing she started to wait for. But peace doesn't hold long in places like Deadwell, especially not for women who've survived what she had. It was the banker, Harris Tillman, who came first. Again, he was always polite in public, wore clean suits and used words like madam and understanding. But when no one else was around, he leaned too close, looked too long. He'd bought out her husband's loan after Frank disappeared, and now he acted like he bought everything else that came with it. You need help, Mrs. Merritt, he told her one afternoon, resting his hand on her doorframe. You don't want to lose the land your dear husband left behind, do you? Cora didn't answer. Her hand tightened around the edge of the door. He didn't press further, just smiled that thin-lipped smile and walked off like he'd already won. Thomas passed Harris on the road that same day, gave him one look, and Harris tipped his hat, but didn't speak. Men like Harris always knew which people saw through them. Later that week, Thomas asked her flatly, "Do you owe him?" Cora hesitated, then nodded once. He didn't ask more, just muttered, "That land's worth more than his interest." Another figure stepped into her life not long after. Liza Pratt, a widow like Cora but twice as outspoken. She ran the local seamstress shop in town and had a way of seeing through people even when they didn't speak. She'd once been married to a drunk who got himself killed in a card game. Now she lived on her own terms, and that made folks uncomfortable. Liza started coming by with scraps of fabric, saying she had extra. She never asked Cora questions, just talked about the weather or town gossip while they sewed or cleaned side by side. Her presence brought the kind of quiet comfort Cora didn't realize she missed, woman to woman, survivor to survivor. And she noticed the limp, Notice the bruises Cora didn't talk about. Men like that rot slow, Liza said one afternoon without naming names. They don't vanish. They spread. Cora didn't answer, but something in her face said she knew. Then came Paul Dobbs. He once worked with Frank on the rail crews, and now did odd jobs for anyone who'd pay in coin or whiskey. Everyone knew he was no good, always watching women with that lazy, cold grin. When he saw Cora limping to the store one day, he made a comment loud enough for her to hear. Bet she ain't much good anymore. People looked away. Nobody said anything. But Thomas heard. The next time Paul crossed paths with Cora on the road, Thomas was there too, standing beside her wagon. He didn't say a word, just stared until Paul spat and walked off cursing. After that, folks said the widower had a sharp eye for trouble, and trouble learned to keep its head down when he was near. Still, Thomas knew enough about men like Frank to understand that silence didn't mean it was over. Frank Merritt had vanished over a year ago, but no grave had ever been found. No body, no proof. Just one night, he was gone, and Cora had stopped looking like she wanted anyone to find him. The town whispered. Some said he left her for another woman. Some said Cora drove him off with her coldness. A few, quieter voices wondered if maybe Frank hadn't left at all. Maybe something darker had happened. But no one asked too loud. Deadwell had its secrets, and people preferred them that way. One Sunday, after church, Pastor Edmund pulled Cora aside. He was a kind man, old and soft-spoken, with eyes that always looked a little sad. He didn't press her with questions, just offered prayer and, once, an envelope with a few coins inside. She didn't take it. "I need work, not charity," she said, voice low. He nodded, not offended. The Lord helps those who stand back up, but he sends others to hold out a hand. That same afternoon, she walked into the schoolhouse, dragging her bad leg, and asked Miss Penny if there was any cleaning she could do. Miss Penny said yes, but told her the floor scrubbers were heavy. "I can manage," Cora said, and she did. By the end of that week, she had 3 jobs: cleaning the schoolhouse, sewing for Liza, and gathering eggs for a woman named Mrs. Varner who couldn't bend down much anymore. She still limped, still moved like every step hurt. But she moved, she fought, and every time Thomas saw her, he noticed how she held her head just a little higher. Still, the tension between them grew thick. Not loud, not awkward, just full of things neither one of them knew how to say. He would chop firewood, and she'd quietly bring him water. She'd fix his torn shirts without being asked. He taught her how to use the shotgun properly one afternoon behind her barn. She held it tight against her shoulder, bit her lip, then pulled the trigger. The kick knocked her back half a step. She winced, but she looked him square in the eye and asked, "Again?" He nodded. Again. By the time autumn reached the valley, the threat from Harris had grown heavier. He started sending men to check on the property. Paul Dobbs came around more often, eyes lingering too long on her porch. One night, Thomas rode out from his cabin with a hammer and some nails. Without asking, he fixed her door, reinforced the windows. When she watched him from the porch, he said simply, "Won't stop a man, but it'll slow one down." She nodded. Her voice shook, but she managed to say, "Thank you." He looked at her then, not just her face, but something behind it, the part that still trembled even when she stood tall. "You ever want to talk about him, Frank? I'll listen." Cora's lips parted like she might speak, but then she looked down. "I can't. Not yet." He nodded once, then went back to work. That night, she didn't lock the door behind him. She left it cracked just enough that the cold wind didn't get in, and she slept through the night for the first time in months. The next morning, Harris Tillman showed up again, this time with legal papers in hand and a sheriff's deputy in tow. They knocked. Loud. Firm. Cora opened the door, standing tall, the shotgun leaning against the frame. Not aimed. Just visible. "I still have a week," she said. "That's what the letter said." Harris smiled, thin and smug. "I've reconsidered your timeline. You don't get to do that." "I do, actually." That's when Thomas stepped out from behind the barn. He didn't say anything, just walked up beside her. His hand rested near his belt. Harris's smile faltered. You tried to intimidate me, Mr. Rourke? Harris asked. Thomas said nothing, but the deputy, a younger man named Cade Miller, cleared his throat. Harris, maybe we oughta give a lady her week. Come back then. Harris looked at him, then back at Thomas, and finally turned. You're just postponing the inevitable. We'll see, Cora said softly. As they left, Thomas turned to her. You still have your fight. Cora looked up at him. I'm trying. He gave a small nod. You don't have to do it alone. She didn't answer. But that night, she left 2 cups of coffee on the porch. When he arrived at dawn, both were still warm. The first frost clung to the edges of Cora's porch steps when everything began to turn. It started small, how it always starts in places like Deadwell, quiet, unnoticed by most. Just a shift in glances, a hushed word between neighbors. But Cora felt it in her bones. Something was off. Thomas had been helping more often, clearing brush, tightening the fence, watching over her land like it was his own. There was a rhythm to it now, something that felt less like survival and more like living. But in the silence of that growing closeness, neither of them spoke of what lay buried behind her barn. Not yet. And maybe that's why the storm hit as hard as it did, because they let themselves hope. The letter came first, folded neat and left on her doorstep. No name, just a short note, scrawled in ink that bled at the edges from damp. He's not dead. He's watching. Cora dropped the note like it burned. Her breath caught, as if the past had reached straight through the cabin walls and pressed cold fingers to her throat. She stared at the paper for minutes before picking it up again, slower this time, reading each word like it might change. She didn't tell Thomas right away. She couldn't. Something in her still feared the man the town believed had vanished. Because deep down, she knew he hadn't just left. And she knew whoever wrote that note wasn't guessing. That night, she lay in bed with the shotgun resting beside her, the same one Thomas had taught her to fire. Sleep came in fits. She woke twice, heart pounding, certain someone was outside. But the yard stayed still, empty, only the wind and the sound of the creek. A few days later, Liza came by earlier than usual, her jaw tight, a bruise fresh on her wrist. Paul Dobbs, she muttered, follow me back from the store. Grabbed me when I told him to leave me alone. Cora froze. Did he say anything? Liza hesitated. Just asked if I'd talked to you lately. Asked if you still limp. The words hit Cora like a slap. Later that afternoon, she took a slow walk to the barn, her leg aching worse than usual. At the back corner, beneath the stacked crates, was the trapdoor she'd nearly forgotten how to open. It was warped with time, but still held. She tugged it open and stared down into the earth below. Dry, undisturbed, but it wasn't empty. Her husband's belt buckle, the one he always wore, glinted faintly at the base of the crawl space. She'd buried him with it. She was sure. She slammed the trapdoor shut, heart racing, vision narrowed to a pinpoint. Someone had been here. Someone had moved him. By the time Thomas showed up that evening, Cora was waiting on the porch. Her hands trembled, her face pale, her voice raw. You need to tell me something straight, Thomas. Have you spoken to anyone about what you saw last year? What you suspect? He paused. No. What? She opened her hand and held out the note. He read it twice, then again, slower. His jaw clenched. You think he's alive? I think someone wants me to believe he is. They sat in silence for a long time, Thomas staring into the woods. Cora, try not to cry. I buried him, she whispered, her voice barely a sound. I didn't mean to, but he wouldn't stop. Her hands trembled harder now. He came to me one night, not drunk, not even angry, just empty, like something had gone out of him. He said I wasn't worth the dirt I walked on. Her eyes dropped. I hit him with the iron pan. I didn't think it would kill him. I didn't mean to, but when he fell and didn't move, I didn't have anyone to call. Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't move at all, just listened. I buried him by the barn. He was still wearing his belt. That's how I know something's wrong. He nodded once. Someone found him. But why now? She asked. After all this time? Thomas looked down at the note again, and for the first time since they met, She saw fear in his eyes. Because someone's ready to use it. That night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Even the goat didn't make noise. Cora sat awake, shotgun across her lap. Thomas slept near the fire, one eye half open, his hand never far from the pistol at his hip. Just before dawn, a rock smashed through the front window. Cora screamed, the sound raw and terrified. Thomas was up in a second, rushing outside with his gun drawn, but no one was there. Just another note, pinned to the porch post with a blade, Frank's knife. The same knife he used to wear on his belt. You should have made sure. That morning, she broke. Not in front of Thomas, but alone, after he left to check the woods for tracks. She sank to her knees in the kitchen and sobbed so hard she nearly passed out. All the years of hiding, of pretending she'd survived clean, came crashing back. When she pulled herself up, she looked at her face in the mirror above the sink, worn, hollowed, but fierce. Something in her had changed. She wasn't going to run. Later that day, the deputy, Cade Miller, came by with a look on his face like he knew something he couldn't quite say. Got a visitor in town asking questions about your husband, he said quietly. A man from Cheyenne. Says he's family. Cora's stomach dropped. Frank didn't have family. That's what I thought, Cade said. But this man had papers. A brother. Thomas, who had come back by then, stepped forward. Did you see him? Yeah, Cade said. Tall, sharp jaw, real put together. Didn't look like a rancher. Thomas's expression hardened. That's not Frank's brother. That's trouble. 2 nights later, someone set her barn on fire. The flames reached high before anyone could get there. Thomas and a few men from town helped put it out, but the damage was done. The back wall collapsed. The trapdoor burned out. The shallow grave underneath it exposed. The sheriff came the next morning. Not Cade, but the sheriff himself, Harlan Black. Big man, dark mustache, never liked women who didn't know their place. They found nothing in the grave. Not a bone, not a scrap of clothing. Looks like you got yourself a ghost story, Mrs. Merritt, Harlan said, eyes cold. But I'm starting to think it might be a real one. Cora couldn't breathe. The man from Cheyenne showed up that same day. Not a brother, not family, just a man with a calm voice and dangerous eyes. He introduced himself as Everett Mace. Said he was investigating old debts. Claimed Frank owed money before he vanished. Thomas stepped between him and Cora. You're not welcome here. Everett smiled. I'll stay as long as I need to, until I get what's mine. That night, Cora told Thomas the full truth. Frank hadn't just beaten her. He'd trafficked whiskey and opium through Deadwell. Used the ranch as a pass-through. When she found out, he broke her leg. Said he'd kill her if she ever opened her mouth. The night she killed him wasn't the first time he'd raised a hand, but it was the first time she'd raised one back. Now someone wanted her to pay for it. Thomas asked only one question. Where's the body? She swallowed. Gone. Someone dug him up before the barn fire. Someone who wants to frame you. She nodded. They started planning that night, talking about what they'd do if Everett made his move. But the betrayal didn't come from him. It came from Cade. The young deputy who once seemed soft-spoken and kind was the one who took a payment from Everett. Who opened the records? Who told Everett about the suspicions around Frank's disappearance? Thomas caught him in town, saw the money exchange, followed him to the livery, and cornered him. Cade spilled everything. Said he didn't know what Everett really wanted, just that he was paying well to make things hard on Cora. Thomas didn't hit him. Didn't have to. He just said, you'd better pray she walks out of this free. Back at the cabin, Cora packed a satchel with the few things she owned. She'd made a decision. I'm turning myself in, she told Thomas. No, he said, firm. You didn't do anything wrong. I buried a man. That's enough in this town. He shook his head. He deserved to be buried. The moment between them felt like the world was holding its breath. Then Cora looked at him, voice shaking. I don't want to be afraid anymore. Thomas stepped closer. Then let's stop being afraid. They rode into town the next morning side by side. Harlan was waiting. So was Everett. And beside them, Cade, trying not to meet anyone's eyes. Cora walked straight up to them. You want to know what happened to Frank? I'll tell you. I killed him. But not out of hate. Out of fear. He was going to kill me. The crowd that had gathered fell silent. Everett laughed. That's quite the confession, Mrs. Merritt. But you don't have a body, she said. And you don't have a crime. Harlan narrowed his eyes. You sure you want to go down this road? I've already been down worse. It was Liza who stepped forward next. Held out a small tin. Inside it, Frank's belt buckle and knife. Found these near my coop, buried in a cloth bag. Somebody's been trying real hard to stir ghosts. Everett's face changed. Just a flicker. But enough. The sheriff looked between them. Looked at Cade. Then at Thomas. Finally, he said, Reckon we got more liars here than killers. He turned to Everett. You got no claim. You ride out today, or I lock you up for trespassing and tampering with property. Everett didn't argue, just turned and walked away. Cora stood still. Thomas came beside her. You all right? He asked. No, she said, but I will be. The town began to shift after that. The whispers died. Liza stood closer. Cade left his badge on the sheriff's desk and never came back. Cora didn't rebuild the barn right away. She let the land breathe, but she did rebuild the porch. With Thomas's help, each board nailed down like a promise. She would not be buried, not by fear, not by the past, not ever again. The porch creaked beneath her as Cora sat in the morning light, staring out at the half-burned barn that still sat like a wound in the yard. It had been 3 weeks since Everett left town, and the sheriff had turned his suspicions elsewhere. But peace hadn't come easy. Not for her. Not for Thomas. The ground might have settled beneath her feet, but inside, everything still trembled. The storm had passed, yes, but it had left behind splinters too deep to pull out all at once. She no longer kept the shotgun beside her at night. Not because she didn't feel the danger anymore. She did, but because she no longer knew who she was with it. The violence had ended, but the violence inside her hadn't disappeared. It just grew quiet. That silence scared her more than anything. Thomas had started to keep his distance, not in a cruel way. He still brought wood, still mended the fence, still passed by her porch with quiet glances, but the closeness that had started to form between them now felt fragile, as if both of them were waiting to see what would break next. One afternoon, while she was folding the same threadbare dresses for the 3rd time, she caught herself thinking, what if he's afraid of me now? The thought knocked the air from her chest. She hadn't told him everything, not the full truth, not the way she let Frank lie in that grave for 3 days before burying him, not how many times she'd considered leaving him to rot inside the cabin instead, not how many nights she'd sat, unmoving, just staring at his still body, unable to decide whether she felt guilt or relief. Thomas had seen enough pain to carry his own weight. But would he look at her the same if he knew how long she'd hesitated? She tried asking him once when he came by with new hinges for the cellar door. If I had told you everything, right from the start, would you have stayed? He paused, hands busy with his tools. Then, I didn't stay because I thought you were innocent, Cora. I stayed because I knew you were human. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. And yet, she didn't feel comforted. In town, folks had quieted, but their eyes hadn't. Some gave her room, some gave her sympathy, but most gave her nothing. No one openly accused her, but she could feel the shift in the way they spoke, in the way conversations ended when she entered a room. At the schoolhouse, Miss Penny asked if she still wanted to clean, as if giving her an out. At Liza's shop, a customer paused mid-measuring and said, I heard her husband's body never turned up, like Cora wasn't standing right there. She didn't answer. She just left. Shame returned like a slow ache. She knew she wasn't guilty, not in the way they meant, but the truth didn't feel clean either. Justice had never looked like this, muddy and half-forgotten, whispered and worn down by rumor. She stopped going to church, not because she didn't believe in grace, but because she didn't think the others believed she deserved it. Thomas, meanwhile, had grown quieter, and not the kind of quiet that came from peace. He was angry at Cade, At the town. At himself, maybe. Cora found him one day behind her barn's charred remains, splitting wood like he meant to destroy it. I feel like I didn't do enough, he finally said. When they came for you, when they doubted you, I should have done more. You stood by me, she whispered. He shook his head. Not loud enough. There was pain in his voice, and it matched hers. The pain of people who had survived, but hadn't healed. One night, just after the first snow, she asked him to sit inside by the fire. He hadn't been in her cabin since the fire, since the grave was exposed. He hesitated at the threshold, not because of her, but because of what had happened here, what this place held. She poured him coffee. They sat in silence, staring at the flames. Did you ever think about leaving? She asked. Every day, he said, but not because of you, because I didn't want to watch another woman break. Cora closed her eyes, holding back tears. I don't know who I am anymore. You're the woman who kept going when everyone else gave up. But I don't feel brave. Bravery isn't a feeling, Cora. It's what you do anyway. That night, he stayed until the fire died. Neither of them said the things that were bubbling under the surface, the desire, the fear, the aching need for something normal. But the closeness returned. Not loud, not fast, just a quiet hum between them. Still, questions lingered. Was Frank really gone? No body had ever been found. Someone had dug up the grave. Someone had moved the belt and the knife. And whoever sent that note, whoever had carved that message into her barn door, had never been caught. Some nights, Cora still woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, certain she heard footsteps near her porch. Other nights, she dreamed of Frank standing in the doorway, smiling with blood on his teeth. Thomas caught her one morning, standing barefoot in the snow, staring out into the trees. What did you hear? He asked gently. She didn't answer. She didn't know. She started to avoid mirrors, started to keep the lamp dim after dark. Not out of shame, but because her reflection frightened her. There were lines on her face she hadn't seen before. Not age, exactly something else. Something deeper. Like every word she'd never said had carved itself into her skin. She tried to work more, cleaning longer hours, sewing until her fingers bled, but exhaustion crept in like rot. I'm tired, she told Liza one afternoon. Then rest. I don't know how anymore. That admission broke something in her. Liza reached out, took her hand, and said, then we'll learn how again. Together. Cora cried. She didn't mean to. She hadn't cried in front of another woman since her mother's funeral. But it came fast and hot, and it didn't stop for a long time. Thomas began showing up more often again, but still said little. He mended the barn wall in silence, rebuilt the porch rail, fetched supplies. But every time he looked at her, there was something aching in his eyes too. One afternoon, as he fixed the hinge on her chicken coop, she sat on the steps and said, do you think we'll ever be normal? He didn't answer right away, just looked up at the pale sky and said, I don't think people like us are meant to be normal. Then what are we meant to be? Still standing. And she was. Somehow. Still, there were moments she didn't know if she could keep standing. Moments she wondered if love, even quiet, cautious, careful love, was too much to hope for. Too much to deserve. She hadn't touched Thomas. Not once. No hand to his. No kiss. No promises. She didn't know how to start. One day, he left a small wooden carving on her porch. An eagle, smooth and strong, wings just starting to lift. She stared at it for hours. The next time he came by, she asked him to sit again. I don't know how to be with someone, she said. I only know how to be afraid of someone. Thomas looked at her, not with pity, but with calm, with patience. Then let's just sit, until you remember something else. They sat until the sun went down. They sat again the next night. And the next. Nothing more. Nothing less. She still woke with bad dreams. Still stared at the barn sometimes, wondering if the ground would ever stop giving up its secrets. But Thomas was still there. And every time she opened her door and saw him, a little part of her loosened. He was not trying to fix her. He was simply not leaving. And that, more than anything, began to change her. The wind had started to change again. Winter was tightening its grip on Deadwell, casting long blue shadows over the land. The ground hardened beneath Cora's boots as she walked, brittle frost crunching underfoot, but she barely noticed the cold. Her mind had been too crowded lately. Uneasy thoughts tangled like wire. For weeks now, she'd carried a strange, unshakable feeling that something was coming. Something wasn't done with her. And then it happened. It was a Tuesday. Nothing about it should have stood out. Thomas had gone to town for supplies, promising to be back before sundown. Cora stayed behind, mending a blanket and listening to the stove creak. She thought about the chicken coop, the seams in her boots. She thought about how tired she was of silence. Then, just as the light outside began to shift gray and gold, someone knocked at the door. Not the soft knock of a neighbor, not the firm knock of a lawman. This one was slow, measured, familiar. Cora froze. She stood so still she could hear her own heartbeat, wild, hammering against her ribs. She moved to the door, shotgun in hand, every breath like ice in her throat. And then she opened it. Frank Merritt stood there, alive, whole, not a ghost, not a memory, not a letter or a knife or a warning from the dark. He stood there like nothing had happened, his face thinner, weathered but unmistakable. Same eyes, same cruel mouth. The only difference was in his calm. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't shouting. He was just smiling. "Hello, Cora," he said, his voice low, steady. "You didn't think you'd seen the last of me, did you?" The world tilted. For a moment, she couldn't feel her legs. She gripped the gun tighter, but didn't raise it. "Not yet." "Ow," she whispered. He stepped inside without being asked. She backed away slowly, stunned into letting him. "You buried me too shallow," he said, closing the door behind him. "Figured someone might come looking eventually. They didn't, but I got out all the same." "You were dead," she said, her voice cracking. "I was close. You hit me good, but not enough. You thought I wasn't breathing. Should have checked. Should have stayed a little longer before burying me in the dirt like a dog." His eyes flicked to the room around them. He smiled again. Place hasn't changed much. Cora couldn't move, couldn't think straight. Her past, her nightmare, stood in her living room, walking, talking real. "What do you want?" she finally asked. He looked at her slowly, eyes dragging over her face like he was taking inventory. "I want my life back. It's not your life anymore." He gave a short laugh. "Sure it is. The ranch, the land, the house, mine. Even the name you've been hiding under. Still legally mine. You gave up all that when you left me bleeding on the floor." She snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. He didn't flinch. "Funny. That's how I remember it too. Except I was the one bleeding." She tightened her grip on the shotgun. He saw it but didn't back away. "You gonna shoot me again, Cora?" he asked. "Think anyone's gonna believe you this time? Everyone already suspects. And now I'm here. Whole. Breathing. That grave out back is empty. You put me in it. And you left me." His voice grew harder. "Cruel. You murdered me. And the whole damn town is gonna know." Cora's hands trembled, but she lifted the gun. Not quite aiming yet. Just holding it between them like a question. "You don't get to come back and ruin what's left of me," she said. "Not now. Not after all I had to survive." He took a slow step toward her. "You didn't survive. You buried the truth and called it strength. You were the truth. And I survived you." Her voice cracked again, but she didn't lower the gun. Her shoulders squared. She could feel herself rising up from the floor of that old memory, where he had left her broken, bloodied, crawling. She had buried that night, buried him, and yet here he was, the breathing proof that her worst fear wasn't just memory. It had never ended. It had just waited. "You're not going to win this time," she said, her voice firm. Frank stepped closer. "You think that quiet man you keep around is going to protect you? What's his name again?" "Thomas." Something in her face must have changed, because Frank's grin widened. "I've seen him. He's got the look of a man who thinks he knows your soul. But he doesn't, does he? He doesn't know what you did. What you let happen before you swung that pan. See him now. Fully. Right at his chest. You're not going to touch him." Frank stepped closer anyway. "You gonna kill me again, Cora?" She didn't answer. Her finger brushed the trigger. And then Thomas's voice cut through the tension. Step away from her. They both turned. He stood in the open doorway, pistol drawn, eyes locked on Frank. No hesitation. No questions. Just a wall of resolve. Frank chuckled. Ah, here we are. Thomas took a step inside. I don't care how you're breathing. I only care that you're gone by sundown. Frank raised both hands. Not here to fight, cowboy. Just for claiming what's mine. Thomas looked at Cora. Is he staying? No, she said. Not an hour. Not a minute more. Frank's grin faded. I've got paperwork, he said. Deeds. Names. Records. I've got a shovel, Thomas said. And a list of men willing to bury you again if you take another step toward her. Frank laughed again, but it was nervous now. You people think this is over. It's not. You're not safe. And then he left. Just walked out the door and disappeared into the cold light of dusk. Neither of them spoke for a long time after. Thomas sat on the step, gun resting in his lap. Cora stood frozen in the center of the room, shaking. She didn't cry. Not yet. She didn't even breathe, it felt like. Finally, she whispered, I thought he was gone. I know. He said he'd come back. I won't let him. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the fury he carried beneath his calm. The way his hands had trembled when he lowered the pistol. The way his jaw clenched like he wanted to tear the world apart for letting this happen. I don't know what to do, she said. We stand, he replied. We make it public. We show the town what he is. But if they doubt me, they won't. You don't know that. I don't need to. I believe you. That word hit hard. Believe. It wasn't something she heard often, and never from a man. They rode to the sheriff's office the next morning, told Harlan everything. About the fire, the threats, the grave, the lie. They signed statements. They gave names. Thomas didn't leave her side once. Harlan listened. Sober. Silent. I should have looked harder last year, he admitted. Should have dug deeper when the whispers started. You still can, Cora said. By sundown, a warrant was issued for trespassing, attempted fraud, and witness intimidation. Frank Merritt was gone by then. He'd vanished before they could serve him. But this time, he didn't take anything with him. No papers, no proof, just fear, and even that was beginning to weaken. Because Cora stood in the middle of town now with her head high. She told her story to anyone who asked. She didn't soften it. She didn't dress it in nice words. She said what she did, and she let them look her in the eye when they judged. Some people turned away, but most didn't. Liza came, held her hand, said, I'm proud of you. Miss Penny gave her the key to the schoolhouse. You'll always have work here. Sheriff Harlan tipped his hat. We'll find him. And when we do, he won't come back. And Thomas, he stayed silent through most of it. But when she turned to him, he took her hand, held it, didn't let go. She didn't cry in public. But that night, in the dark warmth of her cabin, her body pressed to his for the first time, she finally let it break. Let the years fall off her shoulders. Let herself feel everything she'd held back. And when she woke in his arms, the cold didn't seem so sharp. The danger wasn't over. She knew that, but something bigger had shifted. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was fighting, and she wasn't alone. Snow melted slowly from the edges of the fence, the ground turning soft again beneath Cora's boots. Spring in Deadwell didn't arrive with flowers or songbirds. It crept in like a hesitant guest, one uncertain whether it would be welcome. But this time Cora noticed it. She felt it in the lighter air, in the way the wind no longer sounded like someone whispering her name in the dark. It wasn't just the season that had changed. It was her. Frank Merritt hadn't come back. Rumors placed him as far as Montana or down near the Mexico border, but no one had seen him with certainty. Some townsfolk doubted he had ever really returned at all. They said Cora made it up, that the stress had cracked her mind. But the sheriff had seen him. Liza had seen the bruise Frank left on the cabin door. Thomas had looked him in the eye, and that was enough for her. Cora had learned not to argue with people who needed to doubt a woman's truth just to sleep at night. Let them talk. Let them guess. The people who mattered knew. The town, for all its sideways glances and slow gossip, had started to shift too. A few shopkeepers nodded politely now. Miss Penny began leaving hand-sewn gloves in a basket on Cora's porch for the cold mornings. Children at the schoolhouse smiled when she passed. And the first time she stepped inside the church again, Pastor Edmund stopped mid-sermon just to say, "Sometimes God hides his strongest soldiers in the most wounded armor." He said it without looking at her, but everyone knew who he meant. She didn't cry, but she stayed for the whole service. She'd rebuilt the barn. Not large, not like before, but enough to shelter her goats and the feed. Thomas helped. Of course he did. They didn't speak much while they worked. The rhythm of building things with someone you trust doesn't need words. When it was done, she painted the door herself. A soft blue, her mother's favorite color. Thomas had been staying more nights than not, but his things were still in the cabin up the hill. One morning, she found his coat slung over the back of her chair, his boots tucked neatly by the door. She didn't ask. He didn't say. But they both knew something permanent had taken root between them. One evening, as they sat on the porch, she turned to him and asked, "What did you see in me that made you stay?" Thomas thought a long while before answering. "You were still standing." She nodded slowly, then asked, "Even after all I'd done?" "Especially after." They didn't talk about marriage. Didn't need to. In a place like Deadwell, words meant less than action. And his actions were clear. The sheriff had sent letters to nearby territories, passing word of Frank's crimes and disappearance. Nothing had come back, but Harlan said he'd keep looking, and Cora believed him. She wasn't waiting for justice anymore, but she hadn't given up on it either. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a badge or a noose. Sometimes it's simply a woman waking up without fear for the first time in years. She kept working, cleaning the schoolhouse, mending clothes with Liza, gardening again. Things that once felt pointless now felt like reclaiming herself, like pressing seeds into earth and trusting they'd bloom. One afternoon, a girl named Clara, barely 15, came to her door with a black eye and a trembling voice. Said her uncle had threatened her when she said no to his hands. Said she'd heard what Cora had lived through and asked, "What do I do?" Cora didn't flinch, didn't look away. She took Clara's hand and said, "You come inside. You start by not being alone." They let Clara stay the night. Thomas gave her his cot. Liza brought her clean clothes. The next morning, the sheriff took Clara's statement. By week's end, her uncle had been run out of town. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing up for others who hadn't learned how to yet. That became Cora's quiet mission. Not loud, not public, but word spread. Girls came. Women asked. Sometimes just for advice, sometimes for a place to sleep, sometimes for someone who understood. And Cora was there. The past never left, not completely. She still had dreams, still jumped at loud noises. But she no longer mistook her scars for weakness. She wore them the way old oak trees where lightning strikes, still rooted, still growing. One day, while mending a gate near the road, she saw a man riding toward the property. Tall, dusty, unfamiliar. For a moment, panic surged. But when he dismounted and removed his hat, she saw he was just a traveler, thin, tired, polite. "You Cora Merritt?" he asked. She hesitated. "I am." He handed her a folded letter from a woman in Laramie. Said it was important. She opened it slowly, heart pounding for no good reason. The handwriting was neat, careful. It was from a woman named Maybelle Knox. "Your husband came through our town pretending to be someone else. Said he lost everything in a mining accident, but he drank too much and talked too loud. He bragged about what he did to his wife and how she got what was coming. My brother runs the law here. We ran him off. Just thought you ought to know. You were believed, and you're not alone." Cora folded the letter with shaking hands. The traveler tipped his hat and rode off. She stood there in the breeze, eyes burning, and whispered, "Thank you." It was the last she ever heard of Frank Merritt. He hadn't come back, and by then, it no longer mattered. That night, she told Thomas, "I think it's over." He didn't ask what she meant. He just pulled her close. But he didn't make speeches. They didn't need to. The land around them had heard everything it needed to. Years from now, people would say the woman who lived on the edge of Deadwell had once died and came back whole. That she outlived a man who tried to break her and found something stronger than justice, peace. They talk about how she helped other women find their way, how she never raised her voice, but somehow was heard all the same. And in a cabin where pain once lived, love came quietly and stayed. She never begged again. She never limped again, not because her leg had healed, but because she carried it differently. She stood tall, and the ground, this time, held her.